From a humble beginning, in a village belonging to the Kran tribe, Samuel Doe would eventually rise to take control of Liberia in a dramatic and bloody coup d'etat. Born on May 6, 1951, in Tucson, near the Ivory Coast border, his journey began in the military, enlisting in 1969, followed by a 2-year stint at Monrovia's Ministry of Defense Radio Communications School. In 1979, Doe was given training by the U.S. Special Forces and was then made a Master Sergeant. Socio-political unrest between April 1979 and January 1980 paved the way for Doe's ascendancy to power. In 1979, the winds of discontent swept across Liberia. Then-President William R. Tolbert faced a torrent of public anger after his government raised the price of rice, the country's staple food. This unpopular decision ignited a powder keg of long-simmering frustrations. Unbeknownst to Tolbert, his attempts to quell what would be later known as the rice riots would not only reveal his administration's vulnerabilities, but also lead to a tragic loss of life. Over 10,000 Liberians descend upon Monrovia, protesting in a mass display of civil unrest. Tolbert, underestimating the depth of the crisis, orders the use of live ammunition, resulting in over 100 fatalities. The rice riots were more than just a protest. They were the first case of tangible opposition to the ruling True Whig Party, and it exposed Tolbert's tenuous grasp on power. Two key organizations emerged to challenge the ruling True Whig Party: MOJA, the Movement for Justice in Africa, and the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, later the People's Progressive Party, led by the charismatic Gabriel Bacchus Matthews. Both groups energized the marginalized indigenous population and exposed the cracks in Tolbert's administration. But the real upheaval wasn't ignited by protesters or politicians, it was fueled by men in military uniform. On the night of April 12, 1980, a coup d'etat orchestrated by a group of non-commissioned officers led by Master Sergeant Samuel Canyon Doe changed the fate of Liberia forever. President Tolbert was assassinated, and 13 high-ranking officials were publicly executed. Samuel K. Doe stood in front of a makeshift tribunal declaring the end of Americo-Liberian rule, introducing a new era under the banner of the People's Redemption Council. Like many military governments, the new Liberian regime came to power holding out the promise of civil rights and democratic governance. What inspired Doe and his group of fellow conspirators was not a plan for revolution, but simply grievances. Not only were they mainly uneducated and had no prior political experience, they possessed no political objectives, no policy ambitions, and no guiding ideology. What drove and united them was largely their hatred of the Americo-Liberian. Within hours of the coup, the new head of state, Master Sergeant Samuel Canyon Doe, appointed a cabinet of 11 civilian ministers to handle the everyday functions of the government. Among them were 5 activists from the two main opposition groups, the Movement for Justice in Africa, MOJA, and the Progressive People's Party, PPP. These activists were Dr. Togbana Tipote, Minister of Planning and Economic Affairs, Dr. Henry Boima Fanbole Jr., Minister of Education, Gabriel Bacchus Matthews, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chea Cheapu Sr., Minister of Justice, Tourism, and Broadcasting, and Oscar Kia, Minister of Local Government, Urban Reconstruction and Rural Development. They were all well-educated and experienced in government, administration, or politics. Their presence in the government strengthened Samuel Doe's democratic credential and gave credence to his promises that the military would return to the barracks. Fueled more by grievance than by ideology, the Doe government quickly spiraled into chaos. Inside the People's Redemption Council, rivalry and distrust festered. One by one, Doe eliminated his rivals, including some of his most important accomplices. More than 50 rivals, mostly soldiers, were put to death after secret trials. Major General Thomas Wei Sion, the deputy head of state, was the first casualty. Doe's relationship with his deputy, Thomas Wei Sion, degenerated into a bitter feud. Wei Xian, who saw himself as the best-suited candidate for head of state, accused Dou of being a coward who hid outside the executive mansion on the night of the coup. But because Dou was of higher rank, it was he who was awarded the top place. While Wei Xian had to be content with the titles of vice head of state and PRC co-chairman, Wei Xian took whatever opportunity he could to show his contempt for Dou. In August 1981, Wei Xian and many other members of the PRC were detained before being put to death. The regime was shocked by Dou's liquidation of Wei Xian and wondered who may be next. In 1985, the promise of democratic governance was put to the test. Elections were held, but when it became clear that Dou was losing, a suspicious recount was ordered. Dou's government announced he had won by a narrow margin, a claim met with widespread disbelief. Dou's increasingly authoritarian rule sowed the seeds for his own destruction. He systematically removed each of his rivals, amassing more power. Thomas Quiwongpa, once Dou's ally, emerged as his strongest opponent. Dou and Quiwongpa's relationship dramatically changed as they went from being conspirators to being armed rivals, engaging in a life-or-death shootout. Dou tried to have him relinquish command of the army and take over the less powerful role of PRC Secretary General. However, Quiwongpa opposed the action because he believed it to be a flagrant breach of the power-sharing agreement they had made following the 1980 coup. Quiwongpa was also concerned that the president would have an easy path to ultimate power if he gave Dou command of the military. Dou fired Quiwongpa, the man who was the main reason behind his rise to the presidency, because of what he perceived as insubordination, and because he believed it would be too risky to let him continue to be the commander of the army. Quiwongpa was put under house arrest. Quiwongpa was convinced he would suffer the same fate as Thomas Wei Xian. He felt unsafe in Monrovia, so he ran to his hometown in Nimba County, where Dou's killers were waiting for him. Quiwongpa was able to avoid dying and eventually left the nation. On November 12, 1985, when Quiwongpa invaded Liberia from neighboring Sierra Leone while in command of a rebel group he named the NPFL. The main military barracks and the government's radio station were taken over by the armed group when they arrived in Monrovia, and they broadcast a pre-recorded message.
This is General Thomas Quiwongpa. The patriotic forces under my command have seized power. Our forces have completely surrounded the city. Dou is in hiding. There is no escape for him. I call on the men and women of the armed forces.
The coup almost succeeded in overthrowing Dou, but with the aid of his executive mansion guard, who had received Israeli training, Dou recovered control. Quiwongpa was then apprehended and put to death. This event marked a prelude to even darker days, paving the way for Liberia's descent into a civil war that would last over a decade, costing thousands of lives and leaving a nation in ruins. With their patron killed, Quiwongpa's key supporter Prince Johnson and Charles Taylor picked up the mantle of the NPFL to avenge the death of Quiwongpa. On Christmas Eve in 1989, a band of 100 insurgents crossed the border into northern Liberia from Côte d'Ivoire. On 9th September, General Dou decided to leave the safety of his executive mansion to pay a visit to ECOMOG headquarters, accompanied by a bodyguard of 70 Crown soldiers. Tipped off about Dou's movements, Prince Johnson's rebel group launched a raid on the port to capture him. After a prolonged gun battle, Dou, wounded in both legs, was caught and taken to the residential compound of Prince Johnson. Dou was tortured and killed, marking a grim and cautionary end to a life of unfulfilled promises and squandered opportunities. As we look back at this chapter in Liberia's history, we are reminded that the quest for power often trumps the quest for justice. Samuel Dou, a man who rose to power claiming to end the dominance of a privileged elite, ended up mirroring the very regime he overthrew. A cautionary tale that echoes through the annals of history, warning us that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. Join us next time for another exploration into the pages of our shared history.